وعلى آل سيدنا مولانا محمد وبارك وسلم وصلي عليه. الصلاة والسلام عليك يا سيدي يا حبيبي يا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آلك وأصحابك يا رحمة للعالمين. الصلاة والسلام عليك يا نبي الله. الصلاة والسلام عليك يا شفيع الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته to Maulana and to all our guests. Inshallah, we're in this holy month of Dhul Hijjah already. And without wasting too much of time, I'm going to hand over to Maulana. Topic of discussion is the essence of Qurbani. Maulana, tafaddal.
Jazakallah. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillahi hamdan kathiran tayyiban mubarakan fih. والأول والآخر والظاهر والباطن وهو بكل شيء عليم. أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن صلاتي ونسكي ومحياي ومماتي لله رب العالمين. صدق الله العظيم. صلى الله على النبي الأمي وآله صلى الله عليه وسلم. صلاة وسلام عليك يا رسول الله صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم. My respected viewers and listeners, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. All praise is due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our cherisher and our sustainer, and choices of durood and salam be upon his beloved, our master arwahuna fida Sayyidina Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, we are in this blessed month of Dhul Hijjah, the month of sacrifice, the month of Qurbani, and it is important that we understand the essence of Qurbani, and that we don't just continue with this year in and year out just as a ritual, but that we try to introspect, try to reflect on what this Qurbani actually means for us and what it should actually mean for us. If you look at the word Qurbani, it means literally sacrifice. And if you look at the Islamic calendar, you will find that our year begins with sacrifice and our year ends with sacrifice. So our year begins in the month of Muharram al-Haram with us remembering the sacrifice of Sayyidina Imam Hussein radiallahu ta'ala and his family for the sake of Islam. And when our year ends, then we remember the sacrifice of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam when he was willing to sacrifice his son for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So our year starts and ends off by reminding us that we need to sacrifice for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when we start the year and when we end the year, it doesn't mean only in these 2 months that we are supposed to remind ourselves of sacrifice. We are supposed to take this into account and continue our lives throughout the year, trying to sacrifice for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whether it is sacrificing our time, whether it is sacrificing our wealth, whether it is sacrificing our lives for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we need to strive solely for the sake of Allah and His Rasul sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam. Now, when we look at Qurbani, this is an ancient form of worship that has been practiced right from the start of mankind, from the time of Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam. And the very first sacrifice, just for us to understand in context the significance of sacrifice, and then we'll come to discuss the sacrifice of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, just for some background and history. The very first sacrifice that took place in the history of mankind was the sacrifice of Habil and Qabil. Now these were the two sons of Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam. Now at the time of Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam, his wife Sayyida Bibi Hawa radiallahu ta'ala anha, she used to give birth to a pair of children, and one used to be a boy and one used to be a girl. So every time, whenever she gave birth, she used to give birth to a pair, one girl and one boy. And according to the Sharia of that time, the girl of the one pair was impermissible for the boy of that same pair. So the girl could only be married to the boy of another pair, and the boy of that pair could only be married to the girl of another pair. So Habil was born with Liwa and Qabil was born with Aklima. Now Aklima was prettier than Liwa. Now Aklima was impermissible for Qabil. However, Qabil wanted to marry Aklima forcefully, even though she was impermissible for him according to the Sharia of that time. And he argued and fought with Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam, and Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam tried to explain to him, but he was not willing to listen. And one of the first lessons we learn from here is that when one starts to be selfish, which is actually the opposite of sacrifice, when you sacrifice something, then you are giving up something for someone else. And the opposite of that is to be selfish. When you're selfish, then you're only concerned about yourself. Everything is only about yourself. But when you sacrifice, then everything is about everyone else besides yourself. And this is what we see in the life of Sayyidina Imam Hussein radiallahu ta'ala an, that even though he could have very easily worried about his own comfort and his own wealth and living in luxury, but for the sake of the ummah of Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam, he sacrificed his own comfort, he sacrificed his family's lives, he sacrificed his own life for the sake of Allah and his Rasul sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam. And the same with Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. So this is the meaning of sacrifice, when you don't concern yourself about yourself, you concern yourself with others. And when you look at the incident of Habil and Qabil, Qabil was selfish and he was only worried about himself, and he wanted this beauty for himself. He was not willing to follow the Sharia and let Habil be married to Aklima. So he was very forceful, and eventually Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam advised both of his sons, Habil and Qabil, to perform a sacrifice in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he said, the one whose sacrifice is accepted, then a heavenly fire will come from the sky and will burn the one that is accepted. And this is explained in the Holy Quran. So eventually Habil slaughtered a sheep and he left it on the mountaintop, and Qabil, he took a heap of wheat and he left that on the mountaintop. And after some time, a heavenly fire appeared from the sky and burned the sheep that Habil had left there as his sacrifice. So this was a sign that Habil's sacrifice was accepted in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, when he had made the sacrifice and it was accepted, then Qabil had made the intention to kill Habil. Now, I'm not going to go into the further details of the entire incident. The main point was for us to understand the history of sacrifice, and this is where sacrifice actually started. And the main point to understand here is that when Qabil made the intention to kill Habil, because he was jealous now that Habil's sacrifice was accepted in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Habil replied, and this is mentioned in the Holy Quran, that Allah accepts the offering only from the God-fearing, only from those that have fear of Allah. So we can understand from this that when we offer sacrifice, it should not be done out of arrogance, or out of pride, or out of looking down upon those that are less fortunate than ourselves, but we should offer the sacrifice having piety and taqwa and having fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is the first sacrifice that took place, and this is how it was accepted in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through the piety and through the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Habil had. And another important lesson we learn from this is that we, as the ummatis of Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam, we are actually privileged. And often we don't realize how much privileges we actually have just by being the ummatis of Huzur alayhi salam. If you look at throughout history, and even in this example that we have discussed, in the previous nations, whenever anyone offered a sacrifice, then that sacrifice was not permissible for that person to consume. So, example, in this case, that sheep was consumed by the fire, and it was accepted in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it was obviously, because it was consumed by the fire, he could not partake in that. And this was the same in all of the previous nations, that whenever something was sacrificed, people could not consume from that. And obviously this is the actual meaning of sacrifice, where you give up something. But this is the unique speciality of the ummatis of Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam, where we offer a sacrifice in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We give up something for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but yet we are allowed to partake in it. So in actual fact, we are giving up something, but we are getting it in return again, because we can partake in it, unlike the previous nations. So this is something that is a speciality and a privilege of the ummatis of Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam. So we should not take this for granted. So now that we've understood the background of the history of sacrifice, let us go to the incident of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, again to understand the wisdom behind Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granting him this test and granting him this imtihan, where he had to sacrifice his own son in the court of Allah. Now one needs to understand the context to better understand the extent of the sacrifice and the significance of the sacrifice. is that Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, he was granted the son at a very old age, and this after making dua in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala extensively, in his old age he was granted this son, Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam. And having the son and having so much of love and compassion for his son, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then commanded him to sacrifice his son. Now, we need to understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Holy Quran, فَبَشَّرْنَاهُ بِغُلَامٍ حَلِيمٍ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions about Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam and says that we therefore gave him the glad tidings of an intelligent and forbearing son. Meaning the glad tidings to Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, that he was going to be given an intelligent and forbearing son. And this was referring to Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam. Now, there are many wisdoms with regard to this incident, but the most important ones for us to understand in the context of today's topic is one of the reasons for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving this test to Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam is firstly as a test to Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam to show the angels and to show everyone how much of love Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam had for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That even though he was yearning for his son for so many years, for so many decades, and after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted him the son and he had so much of love for the son, but he was not willing to share his love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with anyone, and he was willing to sacrifice everyone and everything only for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is what he demonstrated when he was given this command in his dream on 3 consecutive nights, that he did not hesitate to sacrifice Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So on the one hand, this imtihan, this test, was to elevate the status of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam and to demonstrate to the angels and to everyone the extent of the love of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his closeness. And this is how he attained the title of Khalilullah, the one who is the close intimate friend of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because of his absolute love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then on the other hand, like we had heard in this verse, that had decided Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam as Halim. So he is a forbearing son, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Holy Quran. Now, when this command was given to Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam to sacrifice his son, Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam, Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam obviously would have been subservient to his father's command. Now, how would anyone have understood how forbearing Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam was if this discussion did not take place between Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam and Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam in terms of this imtihan? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam to make mashwara with his son in terms of this command. So even though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave this command to Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, he also commanded him to make mashwara with his son and ask his son what is his opinion about this. And the wisdom behind this is that by him asking his son his opinion, then one comes to understand the level of forbearance and the level of patience that Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam had and the level of trust he had in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because when Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam, when he responded to Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, to his father, he mentioned that whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded him, he needs to fulfill that command. And inshallah, he will find Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam patient and forbearing. Now, this was the response he gave. And later on, when it came to the actual sacrifice, Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam also, he gave a lot of mashwara and advices to Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam with regard to the sacrifice itself, which again leads us to the concept of sacrifice and not worrying about oneself, but rather worrying about those that are around you. But we'll come to that in a minute about these advices that Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam had given. But just to go further from this incident, after Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam had received the response from Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam, then both of them had embarked on the journey to go to a certain place to make the sacrifice. Now on the way, Shaitan came in the form of a friend, in the form of a human, to try and advise Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam first and then Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam to convince them not to go ahead with this. But they both did not pay heed to him and they continued on their journey. Thereafter, Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, as he was walking with his son, then Shaitan comes to him comes to both of them in the form of a very huge and fat figure that had actually blocked off the entire valley where they were trying to walk. So he completely barricaded the way in front of them in the valley and did not allow them to move forward. Because his mashwara, his advices was not taken by them, now he tried to physically block them from going forward and attending to the sacrifice, because even he understood how much of sawab and how much of closeness both of them would attain by conducting the sacrifice for the sake of Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So after this, there was an angel with Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, and that angel advised Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam that he should pick up 7 stones and stone Shaitan. And when Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam did that, then Shaitan went away. After they continued further on their journey, again Shaitan came in the same form, and again the angel advised him to stone him 7 times. And this happened again the 3rd time, when Shaitan came again and barricaded the area, the valley. And again Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam picked up 7 stones and stoned him, and this time Shaitan went away. And this is when they eventually reached where they wanted to perform the sacrifice. Now, a very important lesson we learn from this again is the piety, the taqwa, the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that both of them had in terms of conducting the sacrifice, that they did not allow any obstacle to come in their path that would prevent them from offering the sacrifice for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is something that we need to inculcate in our lives, because often we make good intentions to do something in the path of Allah and His Rasul sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam, and then Shaitan comes and he whispers in our ears and he makes us lazy, our nafs make us lazy, and then we just fizzle out and we leave it. And eventually that good deed that we were supposed to do, it just gets left behind. So we need to understand from this incident that we need to sacrifice our own desires, we need to sacrifice our own pleasures for the sake of Allah and His Rasul sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam if we want to attain the closeness and the pleasure of Allah and His Rasul sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam. So after proceeding, and when they were about to perform the sacrifice, Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam, he offered a few advices to Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. And it is important for us to understand some of these advices in context, just for us to understand the level of forbearance, the level of patience, and the level of selflessness that Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam had. The first thing that he says is that he says to his father that you must tie my hands up. And the reason for this is that when you are sacrificing me, when you are slaughtering me, and you see me in agony, and maybe my limbs might be being thrown all over the place, then he might feel for his son, and there might be some sort of shortcoming in his ibadat, in the sacrifice for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he asks his father to tie his hands. Then he says to his father that his father needs to be careful while he is slaughtering, not to mess and spoil his clothes with the blood of Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam. Imagine, he is about to be sacrificed, he is the one that is about to be slaughtered, but he is not worried about the pain that he is going to undergo, but rather he is worried about the clothes of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. He is worried about the mindset of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. He is worried about what his mother is going to feel. These are all of the things that is going through his mind while he is the one that is about to be slaughtered. And this is what is the essence of qurbani. Qurbani is not just a ritual. Qurbani is we need to feel internally what we are about to do, and we need to have that taqwa and that piety that leads us to do this solely for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this was the level of taqwa that he had, that he was not worried about the pain that he was about to go through. He was rather worried about what his parents are going to go through after he was going to be slaughtered. So he says to his father, don't let my blood come onto your clothes and spoil your clothes, because especially when you go home, then my mother will see and she will become saddened when she sees my blood on your clothes. This is how compassionate he was. This is how forbearing he was in the face of such a difficult hardship. And then he says to his father that you must give my salam to my mother. And he also, the last mashwara he gave to his father, he said that when you're about to slaughter me, put me face down and put the knife onto the back of my neck. And again, the reason for this was, he says, in case you see my face, then you might feel for me as your son, and there might be some sort of shortcoming in this ibadat and in the sacrifice that you're doing solely for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Again, he is not worried about the pain that he is about to go through, but he is rather worried about the shortcomings that might come to his father in terms of that relationship that he has and that love that he has for his son. So again, this is what Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam reminds us and teaches us in this incident, is that when we perform any deed, when we perform any sacrifice, it must be solely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we need to sacrifice both internally and externally. So externally, he was willing to give his neck for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and internally, in terms of his mindset, his mindset was focused only on everyone else around him and not on himself. And this is the main thing that we need to learn from Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam. In today's day and age, in today's community, in today's societies, we all are engrossed and only worried about ourselves. And in fact, the Western media and Western people, they promote this ideology that you must put yourself first and put others second. And this is completely against the teachings and the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam, and the teachings of Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam and Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, and what Islam teaches us. Because whenever it comes to the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam, when it comes to the character and the personality of Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam, we find that he always put himself last. He always put others before him. He always sacrificed his own time. He sacrificed his own Mubarak blood. He sacrificed his own Mubarak perspiration only for our sake, to ensure that till the day of judgment that we have Iman. If it wasn't for that, if it wasn't for all of that sacrifice, all of that torture that he went through in Taif, when people stoned him until his Mubarak blood was drenched in his Mubarak shoes, then what would be the condition of all of us in this day and age? So these are the things that Huzur alayhi salam has taught us, that always put others first and always be willing to sacrifice for the sake of Allah and His Rasul sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam. If you want to attain the hereafter, remember, this dunya is not for us, this dunya is for the kuffar. So anyone that wants to live in this false hope and this false pretense that he wants to enjoy this dunya and maximize the enjoyment in this dunya, he's living in a fool's paradise. Because this dunya is for the kuffar and has been given to the kuffar. The dunya for the world, for the true believers, is the akhirat, and this is what we need to strive for. And if we want the akhirat, then we need to be willing to sacrifice in this dunya. And this is what Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam and this is what Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam are teaching us in this incident, that sacrifice yourself, sacrifice your wealth, sacrifice your life for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you will find how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala elevates your maqam. And this is why today, thousands of years ago, the sacrifice took place, but till today we remember Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam and his sacrifice, and till the day of judgment he will be remembered and his sacrifice will be remembered. And do you know that on the day of Eid, this sacrifice was so beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that this has become wajib on every believer till the day of judgment. And on the day of Eid, there is no greater ibadat. Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala wasallam himself has mentioned that on the day of Eid, there is no good deed that is greater in maqam, that is greater in status in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than performing the sacrifice and shedding the blood of an animal. Why? Because this is the sunnah of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. So even if a person had to spend 1,000,000 rand and millions of his wealth in charity, in sadaqah on that day, that will not be accepted if his wajib has been left out. That will not be accepted if he has not performed the qurbani. And even those millions do not compare to performing one qurbani that is wajib upon him. Why? Because this is how much Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loved the sacrifice of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, that he made it wajib on all of us. And that is the most beneficial action and the most beloved action to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on that day. So this makes us understand that when you truly sacrifice for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala elevates one's maqam and elevates one's status. So this is for us to understand the context of the sacrifice of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. Now, what is the essence of qurbani? In the last few minutes, I will just round up in terms of what we should be getting from this when we are performing our qurbani. Now remember, when we offer our sacrifice, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already mentioned in the Holy Quran that it is not their flesh nor their blood that reaches him, but it is your piety. So when we are performing the qurbani is not about the animal. The qurbani is not about the flesh. The qurbani is not about spilling the blood of the animal. The qurbani is about taqwa. It is only our taqwa that reaches Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is accepted in his court. It is not the animal. The animal is there as a means for us to remind ourselves of the sunnah of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. But the essence of that qurbani is for us to remind ourselves of the taqwa of Sayyidina Ibrahim and Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam. That is the essence of the qurbani, the piety and the taqwa behind it. And this is what is important for us to understand and for us to remind ourselves every time and every year when we perform this qurbani, and inshallah next week when we are performing our qurbani, we need to reflect on this and reflect on the mindset, reflect on the thought process of Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam and what was going through his mind when he was about to be sacrificed, and reflect on what was going through the mind of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam and his fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his piety, his taqwa while he was performing that sacrifice. And that is what we need to focus on when we are performing our sacrifice. And when we are reading our dua, when we are performing the sacrifice and we read the dua, that verse that is mentioned in the Holy Quran, Inna salati wa nusuki wa mahyaya wa mamati lillahi rabbil alameen. Every time we perform a sacrifice, this is what we read. We read, Inna salati, undoubtedly my salah, my prayers, wa nusuki, and my sacrifices, wa mahyaya, and my life, wa mamati, and my dying, lillahi rabbil alameen, is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Lord of the worlds. So every time we perform our qurbani, this is what we read. And we need to ponder over what we are reading. Because what we are actually saying is, undoubtedly, we start off by saying, undoubtedly, that my salah, my sacrifice, my living, my dying is all for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But does this statement that we make when performing our sacrifice, is that congruent with the way we live our lives? Many of us don't even read our salah, ma'azallah. Some of us, when we're reading our salah, our minds are not there, just our bodies are there. But yet we are saying that undoubtedly my salah is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Many of us, when we perform our sacrifices, we perform it as a gesture of pride, showing off and showing others how many sacrifices we are doing, how many qurbanis we are doing. But yet we are saying in this dua that our sacrifices is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we say that we are living and our dying is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But when we look at our living, we don't live according to the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam. If we say our living is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then we need to follow the Sharia in every aspect of our lives. We need to sacrifice our personal desires and not put that over the Sharia. The Sharia always comes above our personal desires. And this is part of the imtihan, and this is part of the test of living as a true believer, that we need to put our desires aside in light of the Sharia. And this is what we need to reflect on when we are performing our sacrifices, that the essence of the qurbani is for us to increase our taqwa, for us to increase our piety, for us to remind ourselves that we are saying that everything we are doing, our salah, our prayers, our fast, our sacrifices, our living and our dying is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we must make that intention while we are performing our sacrifices, that inshallah from today, that I am going to live for the sake of Allah, I'm going to die for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and everything will be only for the sake of Allah and His Rasul sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam. And both internally and externally, I will try to fulfill and walk according to the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam. When one performs and conducts our lives according to the sunnah of Huzur alayhi salam, then one will find the beauty of Islam, then one will find the beauty of living in this dunya. Running after the dunya will not let us find the pleasures of this dunya, but when one annihilates themselves in the love of Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam, then you will understand what true living is, because then you are living it in the shadow of Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam. So this is something we need to remind ourselves and make the time. Remember, the whole point of sacrifice is that we need to remind ourselves to sacrifice for the sake of Allah. So whether it is sacrificing your time, whether it is sacrificing your wealth, whether it is sacrificing your family time, whether it is sacrificing your own time, your own effort, your own sleep, or whatever it is, whatever you can, try to sacrifice for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. because only then will we attain the maqam, and we'll attain what every true believer wishes for in the akhirat, is to have the close proximity to Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam in Jannat. And this is, if you want this, then we need to learn to sacrifice, and we need to learn to sacrifice for our parents, to sacrifice for our spouses, to sacrifice for our children, and to sacrifice for our elders in our community. Everything around our lives must revolve not on us, but must revolve around those that are around us. This is when we will understand the true meaning of sacrifice. You know, we all talk about sacrificing our time and making our qurbani, but we don't even take the time to talk to our parents. We don't even take the time to talk to our elders who are lonely, who don't have anyone to talk to, but then we are too busy in our lives, too busy earning money, too busy making millions, and yet we talk about making our qurbani. So these are the little things that we need to find the time for our parents, to make khidmat of our parents, to make khidmat of our elders, and for us to understand that if we are going to make our qurbani, this is what we need to focus on the piety aspect, on the aspect of taqwa, and then we will truly understand what is the essence of qurbani. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us all the tawfiq and the hidayat to instill in our hearts, to instill in ourselves the true essence of qurbani, and to learn, for us to learn to sacrifice everything for the sake of Allah and His Rasul sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المؤمنين والمؤمنات إنه هو الغفور الرحيم.
Jazakallah to Maulana on that. Maulana, I don't expect these two questions to be answered online, but it has been sent. There's obviously a number of questions, as usual, when it comes to qurbani time. So the first one is with regards to the sacrifice in Pulsirat. How does it work? Because we are most probably making qurbani for 30 or 40 years, and we say that the sacrificial animal will help us cross Pulsirat. That's one point, or one question. And then the second one was about having sacrifices done in another country. Because South Africa's sheep, for example, is 3,500. We maybe get a share in India or something for a cheaper price. Is that allowed? Is it, we need some advice on it. So those two questions, if there's a possibility, no need to answer it online. We can put those two questions later on after the session and maybe try to give some advice on that, and maybe a few other questions that we can post later on to the group, inshallah. But I think the Pulsirat one is a very common question, because I think not only the participants, even myself, we're trying to think, we're cutting for 40 years. So are we going to have 40 sheep coming with us or 40 cows coming with us? But inshallah, I'll leave that to Maulana. Again, Jazakallah to Maulana for your time. Really appreciate it. Like Maulana says, the topic of essence of qurbani is not only referring to the sacrifice of an animal, but the sacrifice of a lot of other things like our time and everything else. So Allah give us the strength and the tawfiq and the hidayat to understand what qurbani is and practice upon the teachings of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Jazakallah to everyone. Jazakallah to Shaykh. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.